Why don't we take our seats and get ready for the last event of the day, or one of the very last events of the day. I'm on the panel, so I feel a little strange announcing it. What we thought when we were putting this conference together was, wouldn't it be a nice idea to be able to hear from the students, to hear from the alums, and to hear from some of the faculty. And so it was a particularly auspicious time because of the fact that we've just expanded in the government department to four full-time FTEs focusing on Chinese politics, which again is unique. So I asked I reached out to my colleague in history, Victor Seal, if he wouldn't mind moderating and herding the cats, as it will. And so he graciously said yes. And so why don't I introduce Victor, and then should we take our places up here?
It was a traffic vision. Right? There you go. It doesn't work as well in Ithaca, though. But there is a lot of construction downtown.
So thank you all for sort of settling down really nicely. This has been a pretty long day for most of you, but it's been great to hear some of the experiences from current students as well as those who have gone on to do many great things thereafter. Andy said, I'm Victor Xiao. I teach in the history department, primarily modern Chinese history, and also stuff on the history of energy. So for people who are interested in energy-related things, I'd love to just catch me in the hallway and we'll carry on that conversation there. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleagues in government, and now I believe Cornell is perhaps the university in the States with the greatest concentration of China experts in the poli-sci department, if I'm not wrong, and we're really proud and excited about that. So what we'll do is we'll get our colleagues to introduce themselves in turn briefly, and then I'll start posing a couple of questions, and we'll open up the floor to discussion. Well, we'll have presentations of varying lengths, different levels of formality. But if we can just go down this way from Alan to Andy, and then we'll start with our presentations.
This was all well thought out in advance. There's a lot of but should we just introduce ourselves first? Yeah. So Alan Carlson, the government department, and many of you in the room have taken classes with me. Those of you who are class majors who have not, then you really probably shouldn't be allowed to graduate.
I'm Jeremy Wallace. I am new to Cornell and to the government department. I was at Ohio State for a number of years, write about urbanization and management of urbanization in China, the Hukou system, and as well as statistics and numbers in China. So we'll talk about that.
I'm Jessica Weiss, also new to the government department after having taught at Yale for 6 years. I'm really delighted to be here and just really inspired by this whole day, both the enthusiasm and articulateness of our students, as well as sort of sobering reflections, but also very helpful guidance offered by the other ones. I personally work on domestic politics in China's foreign relations, nationalism, and nationalist protest are my particular specialties. Currently teaching 2 senior seminars, not on China, but on domestic politics and international relations more generally, and anti-Americanism in comparative history.
And my name is Andrew Bertha. I'm a professor in the government department, director of CAPS. My focus is on Chinese institutions, particularly Chinese bureaucracy. I've written on subjects as diverse as intellectual property, the politics of hydropower, and more recently, China's relations with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the mid to late 1970s. A bit of an ambulance chaser in terms of my interests, but mostly comparative or domestic in focus, but sometimes that bleed over into IR as well. And I couldn't be happier that we had this this group of China scholars within the department and within CAPS. And I think pound for pound, certainly, we are the greatest concentration.
Worth our weight and more. But in my sort of haste to herd cats, I had ignored, I was sort of remiss and I didn't actually tell you what the title of our panel is, and this would really organize some of the debates that will be taking place here, and it's challenges in Sino-US relations in the era of Xi Jinping. As most of you know, President Xi is currently in the US. He was at the White House Thursday and Friday, if I'm not wrong, and that's a couple of really interesting developments that have taken place from this new pronouncement on the cap and trade emissions commitment, at least, which is something as an energy person I'm particularly interested in, to cybersecurity, about which some of my colleagues have much deeper interests. So I figured I'll throw out a big kind of question here, and we'll talk about it in turn, maybe beginning with Andy, and then Alan, and then Jessica and Jeremy, which is what exactly the biggest challenge in what is the biggest challenge that China is facing currently in Xi Jinping's era, and how might this play out in U.S.-China relations in particular? So if we begin perhaps with Andy.
Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? So I think I've got a simple answer to that question, because I think everything emerges from this one simple challenge, and that is Xi's attempts to restructure China's economic system. I think for me, domestically, and I can get into this in more detail, my thinking is China has been in the reform era for longer than it was in its pre-reform era. And I think one of the questions, and that creates a situation where when China first decided to embark on reform, it had a number of challenges that were just barely met. It involved a tremendous amount of decentralization of power from Beijing to the localities, and it also involved being able to liberate half of the countryside that were redundant in the fields and establish a network of factories and industries that were able to create this huge export arm that essentially put its neighboring countries out of business in terms of manufacturing initially low-end exports, et cetera, et cetera. So it very much became an export-oriented economy. That is something that the leadership from Deng Xiaoping on down saw as being a temporary measure. And now we're into something like its fourth decade. And what China needs to do, and the leadership, I believe that the leadership recognizes this, not simply the current leadership, but prior regimes as well, particularly Hu Jintao, is that the economy can no longer focus on low-end manufacturing for export as a means of maintaining high economic growth. That the economy itself needs to become more diversified, it has to have a stronger amount of consumer spending within it, and it has to be able to embrace and become a leader in higher value-added, technology-heavy industries where China should be able to excel, but is not. And it's being held down by a number of different things. And I can go into that in detail, but I won't. Rather, what I'm going to do is go into one particular part that's holding it back, and that is this idea of the way the economy works now is that it's highly decentralized. And my students have heard about decentralization, up to they're shaking their head or nodding their heads and rolling their eyes. But what happened was Deng Xiaoping had a social contract with the party and the people working within the state, that in order to get their agreement to open up to the outside world, to allow things like capitalism or what was seen as capitalism to come into China, that in exchange for their support, Deng would allow them greater economic decision-making power and ultimately greater political decision-making power to some degree. That has become the China that we all know. And yet, that is not the China that Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao can count on to be able to implement the structural reforms that need to be done in China, because local self-interest is at a variance with these priorities. And since in the absence of elections, China cannot, essentially Chinese cadres, in order to move up the system, they have to rely on an internal evaluation process, which up until now has been based in large part on these tangible types of outcomes: GDP growth, fixed investment, and things like that that show that somebody's doing something, but that don't actually add value to the economy. And that is now, all of this is in the process of changing. Hu Jintao had tried to do this with very, very little success. Now Xi Jinping is using a number of other far more draconian measures to get this done, and I think that this is the imperatives of economic reform, economic structural reform, are the things that underlie things starting from his anti-corruption campaign all the way out to the way in which we see kind of the military flexing its muscle. So I should probably stop there. I've kind of thrown out enough things where I can come back to them, but if you ask me if there's one thing that's a challenge above everything else, it's maintaining not the same levels of economic growth as before. Those are non-sustainable, but a healthy single-digit level of economic growth. That is, I think, his greatest challenge.
Andy, if I could just push you to the second half of the question then. In terms of, so you've talked about these challenges of unsustainable growth, but also the concerns of the reformed economy. What bearing might this then have on U.S.-China relations as we see?
Okay, so that's, I think, what we need to, one of the earlier panels brought this up and articulated it better than I could. But I think that we have to understand that China is doing things based on a set of challenges and a type of logic that we're not necessarily privy to. If we're looking at outcomes and extrapolate back from those outcomes, and we base the processes that got to those outcomes based on assumptions that are our own rather than are what's in fact the case in China, then we're going to get it wrong. We're going to get the intention that led to these types of behaviors wrong, and we're going to respond in ways that ultimately become self-fulfilling, somewhat self-fulfilling, vicious cycle. I think if we understand that Xi's flexing of his muscle may well be a function of his weakness and vulnerability within the system domestically, then we might treat what he's doing in China's more immediate Pacific theater, we might interpret it somewhat differently, and our policies would behoove us to have policies that are consistent with those more enlightened interpretations.
So we'll return a little bit to these issues of the vulnerability of contemporary Chinese situation, a domestic situation in our responses later. Maybe I'll move to Alan first and Jessica and Jeremy. Thank you.
Yeah, Andy, that last set of observations are interesting because I think there's a fine line between what you were suggesting, which is greater sensitivity to what might be driving Chinese interests within the Asian region, and possibly going in the direction of over-accommodating the Chinese, which would be about Singapore. Charlie Glazer had a piece recently in International Security where he talks about the need for a new grand bargain, which would be kind of us saying, okay, we're giving up on Taiwan, and you guys don't push out any further. And it's only the type of piece that a non-China specialist could write, I think, because obviously that's a non-starting issue. I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying, but I do think that this administration, and whoever, whether it's a Democrat or Republican who follows, is in a really tricky situation dealing with, and this is what I'll turn to my comments, dealing with an American political system which is fairly fractured and dysfunctional. And conversely, in China, I think we see some of the same things, not in terms of divisions between two parties, left and right, but a country that's really not certain about where it stands and what its position in the world is. I think even the most optimistic of China's leaders 20 years ago couldn't have anticipated or wouldn't have predicted, yes, we will be not on a par with the United States, but certainly the world's #2 and possibly the world's #1 within a few decades. And this rapid sort of success, on the one hand, makes China a global power. On the other hand, I think there's a little bit of an identity crisis going on within the country right now. And I think Xi's policies sort of reflect that. So I think his biggest challenge, actually, and China's biggest challenge, is figuring out how to be, I guess, what we could call a confident global power, as opposed to one that's beholden to historical grievances. And really, what strikes me as almost paranoia in regards to regime insecurity. It is a system that doesn't have a party or an election sort of mechanism to allow for changes of power. So legitimacy is always in question, and I think maybe more than ever at a time now where the Chinese economy, and he's talking about restructuring, Mike had said he's gotten a little bit nervous the last couple of months with the stock market. And Cynthia, that you called him Mr. Zach, I think is wonderful. Maybe I should be more respectful too, Mike. But so for the previous 2 generations of Chinese leaders had some economic scares, but I don't think anything on par with what this is. I was in China for the summer for about 2.5 months, and what I was struck by was actually the lack of confidence internally, that there is a great deal of anxiety at all levels of society about where the country is headed, and this kind of coupled with pride of China being global, but really day to day, what the heck is going on? I was in Tiananmen on June 4th and had my passport checked 3 times, which on the one hand is a show of power, right? I mean, that's something that a powerful state can do. They can make you show your passport at any moment, any time that they want, right? On the other hand, what is so scary about me, right? I teach now a lot about Chinese art, and Ai Weiwei in his Studies in Perspective does this famous sort of thing where he gives the finger, right, to all these sort of institutions of power. I've now been to Tiananmen a bunch of times since I started following Ai Weiwei's work. The most I've dared to do, and this was on June 4th, is I stuck out my tongue like that for a selfie. And I wanted to do the finger and couldn't. And what I mean to say is that this is a regime that I think has some fundamental choices to make about, is it a forward-looking country that's going to contribute to being part of the international order, or is it going to fall into the ranks of other sort of authoritarian regimes that last for a pretty damn long time? Egypt seemed like, Mubarak would go forever, and then it collapses. And Xi, I think, right now, actually domestically is making the wrong choices. They've been studying what happened in the Soviet Union for decades. They've now been studying the Arab Spring and the color revolutions. And the lessons that they're learning, I think, are about turning a little bit inward, about clamping down on freedom of speech and censorship. There's been this crackdown on human rights lawyers. or just regular lawyers, not even human rights lawyers, just people who do regular sort of law. All of which to me is really dissettling. And even though I'm a specialist on international relations and China's foreign policy, I'm more concerned about what's happening within than what's happening about.
I'll follow on here and echo what my colleagues have said. I think we make sort of a harmonious society up here, all singing from the same page. I think that China's greatest problem is really a deficit of credibility, both domestically and internationally. So this search for catchy slogans that ultimately are regarded as empty talk, whether that's the China dream at home or a win-win new type of great power, major power relations, I don't see hordes rushing to believe any of those slogans. And I think that really under Xi Jinping, we've seen kind of a renewed crackdown on popular participation into any of the initiatives that he's put forward. Nationalism, which I study in particular, has been repressed at the grassroots level. We haven't seen any nationalist protests, for example, despite ample perceived provocations by Japan or Vietnam or even the Philippines. And I think that this apparent confidence really does mask this real, deeply perceived sense of vulnerability. And this, I think, the search for domestic legitimacy is really problematic, as it may prevent the kinds of actions that China might need to take to foster a greater international sense of legitimacy. Because what the region, the United States, I think, are looking for from China are credible signals that China isn't out to eat everybody's lunch. And yet, those kinds of making nice with the world, are thus far, there's a lot of lip service to it. Witness Xi Jinping's speech in Seattle, but nonetheless, there really haven't been a lot of concrete actions aimed at diffusing this rising concern about the threat that China's growing power might pose. So ultimately, I think that this sort of domestic tightening on domestic discourse is preventing outsiders from really inferring what it is that China wants. When China and those who speak for China say, oh, we want a peaceful rise or peaceful development, it's hard to know who really believes that answer or believes that answer is coming from actual elements of society rather than just the propaganda mostly.
So having heard all of that, I have various words written down. So identity crisis, credibility, legitimacy, whether the regime is forward-looking, about restructuring the economic system. If the overall question is what is the kind of the biggest problem that China is facing and the biggest issue in U.S.-China relations, for me, I think it's climate change and global warming. I think if you were trying to design a problem that would be hard for political institutions to solve, you would basically come up with global warming. And so just in general, and so one of the things that we're hearing about today is environmental policy, and I think the question there is about implementation, as it is with everything in China. And so some of the work that I've done is about questioning official narratives in China, whether that's what the GDP number really is, or what have you. And so, well, Andy mentioned that kind of what we're seeing is an attempt to restructure the economic system. I don't know if that's actually what's going on. What we see is a restructuring of the political system. And maybe there is some belief that this is about, that a lot of the narratives about why you restructure the political system is to restructure the economy. That this is about kind of getting rid of recalcitrant officials, getting rid of special interests in order to move towards a market economy, in order to maintain the economic growth that China has had, that has been part of its legitimacy, that is going to allow China to move forward into more high-tech and other sectors that might help the Chinese identity and out of this crisis. But I don't know if that's actually what's going on. What I know is going on is that the political system is changing, and that it seems like we are seeing a centralization, in some ways kind of undoing some of the policy changes that happened with the reform era and the decentralization that happened. And so I think that centralization is the story, and I think that it is quite possible that it is about restructuring the economy, but it's hard to say that is necessarily what's really going on. When I look at the system, I look at it as a kind of, whether or not they're making the right choices or wrong choices. Normatively, I don't necessarily like the choices that they're making, but in terms of as an empirical scholar of authoritarian regimes, They may not be making the wrong choices. If what they're trying to do is not help the lives of the Chinese people or kind of make the world a safer place, but try to stay in power as long as possible, I think that they may be making reasonable choices, even if I don't like the kind of results of those choices, even if I disagree with the attacks on lawyers and the crackdowns and the kind of restrictions on even just academic exchanges that I'm glad to hear have not so far impacted CAPS directly, but have made some things harder. And so I think that for me, there's a lot to kind of think about in what's going on in China today, and there's a lot of different stories that we can tell. But what the real thing that I think Xi is doing today is about changing the political system. And I saw Andy wanted to kind of jump on that. So.
No, I completely agree, Jeremy. And that's something that we can see. And that's something that, this restructuring, the centralizing of the political system, bringing of the party into traditional bailiwicks of the government. And these are all things that have been unfolding over the past 2 years with this growth of leadership small groups. Now, my students also know about leadership small groups, and this is just something that has really taken over the system on the top end. So Jeremy is exactly right. I have nothing connecting this with the economy, except that it's, so I'm trying to draw a narrative to make sense of all these things simultaneously. And so I could be wrong. I should also mention that when the first Bolshevik scandal first broke, Alan called me up. I said, "What do you think of this?" And my response, flash in the pan, that thing happens all the time. So really you need to take what I say with a grain of salt. But if you stick with me, in terms of seeing all these things fit together, if this centralization is in fact in the service of restructuring the economy because the things that happened before did not work, and if you see the anti-corruption campaign as a way of getting these recalcitrant officials out of power, one of the ways to think about it is, basically you're forcing these local cadres to accept a new way of doing business, both literally and figuratively. It means forcing them out of their comfort zones, knowing what will get them promoted. It means forcing them in ways that might hurt their prospects, that might hurt their dependents, whether it's their family, their inner circle, or their constituents. They might be worse off, possibly much worse off, by this restructuring. Now multiply this by 30-odd provinces, keeping Taiwan ambiguous here. 2,000 counties, hundreds of cities, and over 1 million townships and villages, and you begin to understand the magnitude of the problem. So I see that as, you can never see a causal link. I'm just suggesting that it might be there. And therefore, if it is there, then what does that say in terms of China's behavior? This gets to Jessica's point, which was about how China is perceived abroad. I've always felt that China cares much more about its domestic audience than what the international audience might think. You can always repair things with the international audience, and things get too bad, time will heal. Beijing, the things that keep Beijing's leadership awake at night are in my view, are domestic. So I think that they've been kind of ham-fisted and not terribly careful and caring about their image abroad, because although it would be nice to be able to nurture that, it's just not the time for it. I think that this was a point that, and this gets to what Alan was saying about underestimating or overestimating. So I'm not disagreeing with anybody here. Rather, I'm trying to kind of weave this into my narrative. This idea of overestimating and underestimating, one of the things that happened when Obama came to power in 2008 was he basically offered a fig leaf to China. Olive leaf. Okay.